You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hello, BioTalk listeners. We have another edition of BioTalk coming to you with a very interesting guest for you today, and someone who is growing in stature within the biohealth capital region. It's Dr. Nehal Mehta, who's the founder and CEO of Mobius Scientific. You're going to learn all about his company and his background and where he's residing today and all of the growth about this great new company. And Dr. Mehta, welcome to BioTalk. I know we're going to have a very interesting conversation for the next half hour.
Rich, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
And I think the listeners would, rather than I talk about all of the accolades related to your background, I'm going to let you do a self-introduction. Walk us through from how you decided to become a doctor and get into medicine and how this transitioned your career to NIH professor, now this entrepreneurial world in this venture that you're going down right now. So take it away and give us a little background.
Thank you, Rich. So it's always best to start the story with, I've had a passion for asking questions my whole life. So I grew up in South Jersey on a beach. I grew up surfing, really think that the ocean teaches us a lot. And I had a very early passion for asking why and how things happen. One of my earliest memories was when I was 10, I had a watch that told the time and the temperature as well. And I wanted to know how hot a microwave got. So I threw that watch in the microwave. And little did I know that you're not supposed to put metal in a microwave, and a little bit of a fire started. And my parents, instead of being upset, were actually patient about it and understood that I had a question to answer. I did get into some trouble and I did get grounded, but it was the first time I realized that I always want to answer questions. That's why I pursued medicine. So after growing up in South Jersey, I attended a 7-year medical program at GW in DC, and I really grew fond of the nation's capital. And then from there, I learned that in addition to being a physician and answering questions, I really learned how to be a physician scientist during my training at Penn, where I trained in internal medicine as well as in cardiology. I took a couple extra years and I did a postdoctoral fellowship with Dr. Dan Rader, understanding how our body regulates cholesterol through the reverse cholesterol transport system, something we'll get back to later. From Penn, I then got recruited to the NIH as the first Lasker clinical scholar, which afforded me a 10-year opportunity approximately and about $30 million in funding to really experiment as to answering more questions. And what I decided to really understand was why inflammation in the body drives heart disease. And our earliest discoveries started with a disease called psoriasis in the skin. We uncovered why and how heart attacks happen early in that disease. But the tenure there ended with me really understanding how the body removes cholesterol in inflammatory states and how that detriment drives coronary artery buildup. The last step of that was when I decided, after a decade of great service to the NIH, I left and I was founder and CEO of Mobius Scientific, and I became an entrepreneur just over about a year and a half ago. And it has been such an exciting journey. I get to meet people like you, and I get to meet a great, growing, booming community here back in the DC area. And I'm just really excited to be able to share this story, not only of myself, but of Mobius.
Well, I think that's a great introduction, Nehal. And when you talk about this entrepreneurial journey, was there somebody that influenced you to take this step to go from the scientific world that you had at NIH and education and take this big jump into entrepreneurship?
Rich, that is a really great question and a great time for me to think about the strong relationship that I have with my executive chairman, Dr. Raj Shah. About 5 years ago, Raj and I had met, and he had noticed that I'd been doing some work that had public health implications. And he asked me, he said, could this be applicable elsewhere? And so the discovery of reversing coronary disease about in 2018, I have to say he probably was the one who convinced me that there is a side of science that sometimes, in order to translate it to that next step, requires that little bit of what one would call a pull or a push. And I think that what Raj and I have been able to do in Mobius is embody that, which is solving a big problem of taking cholesterol accumulation in one part of the body and moving it to another. And I don't think I would have been able to do it without such counsel and such encouragement, because it's something that I know that he had gone through years back when he had left the federal government and took on his next position. But I'm glad you brought that up, because typically in science, we think of mentors, and in entrepreneurship, we may think of sponsors. But I think that they're both interchangeable, because I do feel lucky that I was able to be looked at and reminded of the importance of different scientific applications of the same pieces of data.
Yeah, and what's interesting is there's mutual respect, because basically you've asked him to be on your board and he's accepted. So he wants to continue this journey with you. So that's nice that you're going to be able to continue that relationship, Nehal. So you started talking a little bit about Mobius and a little bit of science. Let's do a little deeper dive now and talk about, first of all, how'd you get the name? What's Mobius stand for? Second of all, where did the original science come from? Was it your science, or is it something you're licensing, or how did this evolve? And basically talk a little bit more about the company and the direction you're headed with it initially.
Yeah, with Mobius, the name, interestingly, when I first learned early on about the technology that the Mobius disk embodies, when I examined looking at it, it reminded me of an infinite loop. So, Rich, if you took a hula hoop, or for lack of a better, something round that's able to be twisted on itself, and it can become actually two circles, the twisting hinge points and the shape that that comes from is called a Mobius loop. It's an infinite Mobius loop. And so every circle naturally occurring has a twisting point that then allows it to become a Mobius loop. And our Mobius technology, the Mobius disk, actually is a human protein that I had studied for 10 years. And then the inventor, Steve Slygar, over at the U of I Champaign, had clipped parts of that and made it so that we could take that protein and make it more efficient for, in his case, studying membrane biophysics, but in our case, removing lipid and cholesterol directly from tissues. So when I saw the foundational science, I actually knew that the nanodisk, or the disk that itself, it makes this Mobius loop, was able to be coupled is to be a human therapeutic. And with that human therapeutic use, Mobius is pursuing a targeted cholesterol removal model. It's called targeted cholesterol accumulation. So just to take a step back, lipids deposit in tissues and cause disease. And we've learned this from, of course, heart attack and stroke. Here, what we've discovered in 2020, one of our co-founders, the ophthalmologist, Dr. Raj Apte, another Raj, has discovered that the cholesterol accumulation and lipid accumulation in the eye is actually the leading cause of blindness in this country, a disease called age-related macular degeneration. And Mobius is targeting a high-risk form of that age-related macular degeneration called geographic atrophy. So as a group, we've taken an invention that was never put into humans. We've now adapted it into human use, and we're now making it to inject locally into tissues, starting in the eye, for cholesterol removal.
So you're basically saying, thank you for that explanation and the scientific background, but the origin of the science actually evolved out of the University of Illinois in Champaign, correct?
That is correct.
And you basically got access to this technology in Mobius. How? A lot of those potential entrepreneurs out that are listening want to know, how did you access that technology to be the foundation for Mobius Scientific?
So when that product was being used to study viral entry by this inventor, I called up his lab because his lab had asked if there was a way to get this particle into a human cell type that I had been studying, a liver cell. So simply, if one needs to reach out to somebody who holds a technology, my approach involved scientific connection, asking a direct question of, have you ever considered adapting this for human technology? But it was an introduction made through just the scientific literature, because the protein component of the disc is actually a protein which we had been studying years past. So our paths kind of converged and crossed. However, The second part of the story, which is how did this get involved with the eye? That's also a good part, which is the ophthalmologist who had discovered this. I had read his paper and I called him up as a peer and as a potential entrepreneur and said, I think we can solve removing that cholesterol from the eye. I just made a phone call and I made a simple request of licensing that technology, which was methods of use of cholesterol removal from the eye. So he became a co-founder. University of Illinois Champaign became a co-founder. Raj and I had to put this company together, and we had somebody very graciously help us put the company together from the building blocks as an operating officer, and we put Mobius together from the group of 5.
Super. Thank you for that background. And it also shows how the interaction between academics and potential entrepreneurs and scientists all come together, but you recognize where your strengths and your weaknesses were when you were assembling your team and brought other people together with you as you founded your company. So let's talk a little bit about intellectual property. This isn't something that we had discussed before, Nehal, and we're talking to Nehal Mehta, who's the founder and CEO of Mobius Scientific. Talk a little bit about the IP protection. When I hear cholesterol and eyes, basically, that's not the first thing I think about in cholesterol. I would imagine you have some unique intellectual property to protect your science.
So one level of protection is the methods of use patent. The second one is we have established by submitting our own composition of matter patent for the use of the disc in eye disease for geographic atrophy, as well as a whole host of other indications, which will allow for lipid accumulation treatment in the eye. And then thirdly, the actual manufacturing of the product from the basic components out to good manufacturing practice, all are patent protected under our current IP portfolio plan.
Super. Basically, you say other indications. So you really don't have a one-dimensional technology. You have something that would be referred to as a platform technology. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the beauty of the Mobius disc is that first therapeutic product that we are making actually is going to hit not only the eye using the same intravitreal injection vial. You can now dose that for other therapeutic indications, including inflammatory removal of debris from other tissues in the body. We have 2 other programs that are just a step behind the eye program in this platform. But better yet, once you look at the disc itself, it actually has the ability to load itself up with cargo, which is the new downstream next part of the platform, which is once the eye and the other indications are done, we'll start adding cargo into the discs.
And this lipid accumulation, who was the first one to identify that it was really a major cause for AMD?
If you look at the basic models, I would say that Christine Curcio and Raj Upte and the group that really has looked at retinal physiology over years were the first to identify it. But I would point the listeners to the New England Journal 2020 practice piece, which is written by Dr. Upte, which is called Age-Related Macular Degeneration, a clinical perspective. And what that elegantly points out is that what we are doing in the eyes, we were doing in the heart in the 1950s. We didn't know about cholesterol in the 50s. We didn't know about factors of risk for developing heart attack. But look at what we've done between 1950 and 2000. Our heart attack rates have come down by 70%. Now we need to turn to the eyes. And the eyes, when the lipids accumulate, we learn that at the 50s. We do a fundoscopic exam. We just let that accumulate until you start losing sight and losing vision and then soon lose your driver's license. This becomes an issue. This becomes an issue for not only America, the world, but also society. People are living past the cancer age. They're living past the CVD age, but they're making these losses of vision a problem for their activities of daily living. So Dr. Raj Upte probably gets the biggest credit for getting this out to practitioners, but the journey is just starting right now, Rich. We have a lot of work to do to let people know that cholesterol also damages the eyes.
Yeah, and I think that this podcast will help educate a number of people. Let's talk a little bit about lifestyle versus genetics. How much does lifestyle impact the lipid buildup in the eye versus genetics?
I used to believe, if you had asked me this question 10 years ago, I would say that the genetics were not as important as lifestyle, because as a younger road warrior, nothing's really ever going to happen. But as I've aged, Rich, I do believe the impact of genetics is probably very hard to ignore. As a South Asian male, we've been put into the guidelines as having dysregulated cholesterol metabolism, lipid accumulation, which warrants early statin treatment. Lifestyle matters. I do believe that everybody should be getting their cholesterol accumulation down by a little bit of exercise, watching what they eat per se, getting their cholesterol checked. It's important. But what Mobius is trying to accomplish here, Rich, is people always will do what's best at the time for their health, I hope. But there's going to be times of excess cholesterol deposition that even pills and injectable medicines like PCSK9s are not going to be able to solve. And so Mobius has invented a way of almost putting in what I would call a cholesterol sponge, whether it's in the eye, whether it's in the skin, whether it's in the heart. And we are able to directly remove all those years of excess cholesterol buildup using this biologic therapy.
So just from a clarification standpoint, what you're developing is probably not a cure for AMD, but it will basically stop the progression of AMD once your technology would be applied. Is that correct?
There's both is correct. Thank you for bringing that up. We anticipate first being the root cause of geographic atrophy, targeting lipid accumulation. We anticipate that we can not only halt the progression of future worse atrophy of the lipids of the retinal pigment epithelium, but in doing so, what we also will anticipate seeing, especially in single payer systems, we will anticipate seeing earlier treatment of this cholesterol in the eye to prevent dry AMD from forming at all. There's two types of AMD, and both of them are driven by lipids, one a little less than the other. 80% of the world's blindness is driven by dry AMD's lipid accumulation. And so our goal is to get that disc to just sponge that cholesterol out.
You just mentioned something very interesting. You talked about payer. So if I'm a venture capitalist today and you've got this great technology, one of the first things the VCs or the investors are looking at is you might have great technology, even if it's needed. Who's going to pay for that for the patient? So I'm sure you've looked into that a little bit, Nehal.
We have, Rich, and it's an interesting, so before I got into this new life of entrepreneurship, just for 10 years, I ran well over half a dozen biologic trials in different diseases in humans. And what I've learned is if you're able to understand the positioning of the biologic and what it will be used for, it's very simply a matter of, does this impact an outcome that matters in quality of life years? So I'll start there. If the number of quality of life years happens to be something society cares about, my citizens are happy, they're working, there's a set number. So the cost of a biologic for the eye might be high in a paying system like America, where we are more symptom driven and reactive. However, in a single payer system where you are dependent on the citizens of that society to keep things going, it behooves you to keep them seeing. It behooves you to take the injection at 50 or 55 once before you develop symptoms and pay the cost for that. The cost of goods for this is very small, Rich, because remember, we're not a systemic biologic, which requires 70, 80 milligrams per dose. We're an intravitreal therapy, which requires 7 to 50 micrograms per dose. So we're using 1,000th of the protein. We're helping getting it directly into the tissue. And so the single payer system to me is the perfect model for this. Want to keep your society seeing, you want to start early intervention. But until then, we do have a promising treatment in America that we're developing for geographic atrophy, where people are waking up the next day with a new hole in their retina so they can't see. And our data currently shows that in our preclinical models, we're able to stop that amount of lesion formation and atrophy.
Excellent. And I'm going a little deeper into the science than I normally do with a guest, Nehal, because it's a very interesting topic. You also said getting an injection once at age 50, for example. With this technology, how many injections might you need over the course of your lifetime once you've started treatment?
You know, the beautiful thing about cholesterol is that it accumulates, and now we've been able to show we can remove it. The way that cholesterol works is it's a hunk of a mass. And so you do get to chip away at it. And if the out is less than the in, you actually hit what we call steady state health. And so based on early studies right now, we anticipate a monthly injection for 3 months, like a loading dose, get the cholesterol working, get it and get out of there. And then having a yearly injection based on imaging. You'd actually look at the eye and see, is there cholesterol? Let's get you a shot. Is there no cholesterol? Let's see you next year. Right now, we're already doing the yearly exams, Rich, but we're just not acting on them. We're waiting for symptoms.
One last question on the technology. And you say the injection into the eye. Would the lipid buildup potentially only affect one eye, or does it always equally affect both eyes?
It's a great question, Rich. And one of the jokes that I sometimes make in my new life is that I've learned in this new life that humans have two eyes. And why I say that is that other eye that you're talking about is called the fellow eye. And gosh, the fellow eye works really well and does its see. So you do want to preserve that eye. So geographic atrophy occurs in the other eye with about 50 to 70% simultaneity. So you'll actually get it in the other eye. And what the goal would be, we would never inject both eyes ever. We would give the treatment to the eye that's really progressing. And then during that trial, we will learn the importance of how the other eye progresses, and then we'll design studies based on that.
Well, you've done a great job of explaining the science and the technology and the delivery method, Nehal. So let's move on to the company now. Basically, when you got this idea that you wanted to become an entrepreneur, generally an entrepreneur doesn't know everything about everything, and they have to surround themselves with other people that can complement them. How did you go about identifying your team that you wanted to work with and advisors that would be able to supplement those skills that your team might not have?
Even first principles here at Mobius, I've always followed the path of I want to do the best work with the best people with the best attitude. So I looked across the board and said, well, first I need somebody to help me build this company. And I found Pranav Vora, my COO. Raj and I sat down and said, well, we have the ophthalmologist and the inventor here, Steve Sligar and Raj Upte. What are we going to need to get us to the next step? And so we built our advisory panel based on someone who's built an ophtho company, someone who's built a CV company, someone who actually built a company making biologics. And so we went through and we first enlisted Rahul Singhvi from Resilience as an advisor. Rahul has made Resilience a leader in manufacturing anything from nucleic acids all the way out to biologics. We then found ourselves in need of a regulatory expert as well as somebody who's done a clinical path forward. And we found ourselves with Dr. Rob Cotton, who's done this through gene therapy. And then we went through, and Rich, I'd say that the list goes on where even our lead clinical advisor right now is Dr. Barry Cooperman, who happens to be just a real great retinal surgeon, knows the science and wants to help this field advance. We really do just let people know what we're doing, what our mission is. Our why is our strongest reason why we do things. Our how we get things done is sort of what we're learning as a rough startup, that everything gets done when you actually sit down and put your mind to it. And then the part of how we get the who, it's the hardest when the honest answer is we pick up the phone, we let them know that what we're doing, and we have had no folks not want to join on this great mission.
That's a great explanation. So basically, there's three parts to building a team. One is the operating team, which are the employees that run it day to day. You have your board of directors, and then you have your scientific advisory board. So a lot of entrepreneurs do not really think too much about the SAB or scientific advisory board. And sometimes they bring onto their board of directors people that they're going to pay for services every day, rather than bringing on experts that would complement them. So did you use somewhat of that decision criteria as you went through those selections?
Absolutely, Rich. And that was very well said. You put a nice architecture around what I had said, which is if you do think about, you had brought up my exec chair, Raj and I making up our board. And then starting from there, what I described to you exactly was my scientific advisory board. The operations of the company are, of course, between me and my operating officer. And the best way to describe how all of those came together and the priority with which they came together was to complement all of the weaknesses and holes that I knew we had as a group. And it became evident the better we found the weaknesses that we had getting filled, the better our team became. So now we all talk about what we don't know how to do, and that's how we solve problems.
It's easy to get the company started, but then you have to raise money. You have the science, you have your team, you have your SAB. Talk a little bit about how you just made the decision of how much money you needed and how you were going to get started funding and your funding history over this last year and a half.
I've learned here different than science. So science, you write grants. And like I said, I wrote a grant and I got $30 million for 10 years. And that was a blessing for not having to continue that process. Here with fundraising, the first thing that I would say is that it's always unexpected to know that you're going to get $1 in the door, but keeping the same principles as you fundraise, as you build the company, which is we do believe that there is an important amount of science that needed to be done. So we priced that out. We then took the amount of science and we priced it out with, was it going to be better quality and less expensive to go to a university, or do we do it at a CRO? And then we built a budget, Rich, and our budget happened to be fairly aggressive because for us, time was of the essence because there's other competitors in the field that we felt that a little bit more money would be better than less money. So we took the number of experiments, we tallied up what that number was, and we went out and we raised that. And I'd be happy to say that in the first year, we raised about $2.5 million from friends, family, as well as some high net worth individuals and retinal physicians. About a year and a half, so about 6 months ago, we got our first, what we would call high net worth individual that then connected us to a few LPs who are financial investors. So now we're just finishing up our seed round. We're raising our last 5 million to close our seed. And we're going to open up our Series A, probably Q4 of next year of 2024, where that'll get us through to phase 1. How to know how much to raise and when to raise, I think is important for the entrepreneurs who are always in it, always best to take the most money you can get. We've done a lot with a little. Mobius, what we do is we believe that our next value accretive milestone will come with this next closing of the seed round. And for us, it's producing it and getting our IND enabling studies done, but raising the right amount of money. And then also, I'm lucky enough to be talking to you. You've been very generous with helping us in this local growing environment, which is this life science community in the DMV, which I truly believe could be second to none on the East Coast, let alone in the country. So just knowing the right partners to find locally as well as nationally has been how we've been able to be lucky enough to raise the funds.
Yeah, and another thing people always ask about entrepreneurial founders is, in order to incentivize friends and family and other investors to get involved, did they want to see that you were going to be financially at risk as well, Nehal?
I do think so. They do think that one of the biggest risks that I think I mitigate was the relationships that I'd had with friends and family. Didn't matter that I'd come to them as an entrepreneur. I came to them as Nehal Mehta. They had known me for 20 years. They had seen the ROI at the NIH. They had seen what I had done at Penn for 10 years prior. And now's the next 10-year segment, maybe hopefully longer segment of entrepreneurship. So the risk mitigation, what I've learned with funding bodies is it's about de-risking what they're putting in. And for me, I think I provide the first set of de-risking with my friends and family investors.
Also, one of the things you decided to do is to enter contests, because there's a lot of competitions out there, business plan competitions and technology competitions, and you got on that bandwagon a little bit. And I guess there's a couple reasons to do it. There are some small cash prizes, but also the visibility you get, I think, is fantastic based on your presentation to potential investors. So talk a little bit about that experience.
I would be happy to, because that was something that I never really thought about as a recently converted academic physician. What I would consider to be 20 years of academic work would be a roadshow of slides that would show my expertise. And then we would talk about how we're going to move that work into that institution. And that's the academic model. What I learned from not only Johnson & Johnson's labs, we're a JLab startup company, but then you and the BHCR very nicely was there are pitch competitions where you can put together a pitch deck, which thanks to, again, lots of great resources, formulaic. You can actually put it together as 7 to 10 slides and then put that together. We were put at the crab trap competition with your group. We would then down at Charlottesville at the BioSpark with about last month. And then we actually just finished another one here in Arlington. And we've won all 3 of those, mainly, I think, because the mission is strong, the why is strong, but better yet, we've put together a great amount of momentum. Thank you for bringing it up, Rich, because what it also taught me was business cards, QR codes, LinkedIn, all jokes aside, that is some of the best exposure and networking because there's nothing like good old-fashioned human relationships. And you get to meet people, you get to see what they're up to. So I really can't over stress the importance of what you've taught me, which is get out there and really show what you're doing at every stage, because there'll always be interest in learning about how you can innovate based on what you get as feedback.
You know, what's amazing is we didn't even know about your company, and we got referred to you by a very prominent company in the biohealth capital region, JP Morgan.
That is wonderful because I had said to JP Morgan Partners just about 3 or 4 weeks ago that with the right partnership, from what I've seen with both your introductions as well as theirs, this is quite a region.
Let's talk about the region. You probably could have gone to Boston, San Francisco, or many other places. And having been at Penn and NIH over 20 years, you made national contacts and international contacts to where you could actually choose to go anywhere. So talk a little bit about why the decision's been made to stay right here in the biohealth capital region, Nehal.
There's a growing need for, I think, transformative companies that are non-tech in this area. We do very well in tech. We do very well in other industries. But there is a brain drain when the IP leaves the NIH or the IP leaves these areas and it goes other places. So I felt that the first reason to stay was I knew the area, I knew the partners that could form here, and I had known that there was going to be great lab space in the Montgomery County area. I knew that there was going to be great partners as well as mentors in the area who would want to join. The other big reason, Rich, was that J Labs offered us a competitive spot in their innovation center. And what that allowed us to do was really get out of the gate with a year of what I consider to be a partnership. It's coming up on a year and 5 months where we will have gotten introduced to not only some coaches, you, a couple other innovation hubs. And I do believe that the DC area allows for great intellectual exchange of multiple disciplines. So you have a very strong law practice around, you have very strong biodata analysts, tech factories around. And I do think that that provides a good foundation for what Mobius is move into. Finally, I'd been in the Philadelphia area, I'd been visiting the Boston area, and I did feel that the Bay Area, all three could have offered Mobius a little bit more of what I would consider a thrust forward. But it would not have felt as genuine as the partnerships that I have made over the last 10 years here in the DMV, both through the NIH, but I'm also a professor of cardiology at GW. So I practice medicine downtown. And so I feel indebted to the community for providing me a rich environment to not only practice medicine, but practice my science as well.
We're glad you made the right decision. There was no reason to leave, and we think you're going to be a growing part of this ecosystem here, Nehal. So you've done basically a good explanation, the company, the funding, the science, the technology, your incubation with J Labs, which is fantastic. Talk a little bit about what are some of your critical milestones and goals that are important for you to achieve here over the next 1 to 3 years.
I'll start with the 1 year and then I'll move forward. So Rich, right now, as the quarter ends, I always love this time of year because people want to just remember that we are blessed to have our friends and family around and we can spend some time with them. But at the end of the quarter, if we can close our seed round of what we're trying to raise for the 5 million, our next value accretive milestone is to make our product so that it's ready for GLP-1 toxicology safety studies. So we're going to do that for 6 months. And then we have a pre-IND meeting with the FDA to clear our path to clinical approval. That'll be in Q1 of 2025. And then if everything works out correctly, by Q3 of 2024, next year, we will be ready to open up our Series A for 40 million, at which point we will have a biologic safe for human use for at least one, if not two indications. I'd be remiss not to bring up our IP strategy is dependent upon constant checking about not only our freedom to operate, which has been cleared, but also submitting patents. So we'll continue to do that as well, Rich.
We've talked about funding. One of the things we didn't focus on was the non-dilutive funding, because you can raise your equity, which is you're trying to close out another 5 million here in your pre-seed round or pre-series A round. But there's also non-dilutive funding, which I think is available for companies like yourself to apply for. Do you have a strategy there?
I do. I'm glad that you brought that up. I think that that should be the first thing we always talk about with fundraising. If you happen to know what your science is and you know how to write it in any sort of a grant application, I would urge you to seriously consider looking at either the NIH or the NSF's SBIR programs. There's others out there, but those are the two that I am familiar with. If you are incorporated and you have the ability to show the NIH that you have an idea that requires a phase 1, which is usually proof of point or proof of concept, they'll award you anywhere between $200,000 and $400,000. We just got great news that our phase 1 application just received its notice of intent of award. So great news there. And then the phase 2 program is $2.4 million, and it follows if you complete phase 1. I would say the non-dilutive funding piece does make you realize where you are weak. You'll find out where you don't have partnerships because you're putting it all down on paper. And we're now actively writing our phase 2. So maybe 6 to 8 months, I'll have a better sense of what that impact is. But I would urge any entrepreneurs out there, they call it America's Seed Fund for a reason.
And you're talking about the NIH $1.4 billion they have available to small businesses annually. And the other thing is all of your venture capitalists, high net worth individuals, and equity investors love the non-dilutive funding that comes in because it doesn't change the equity ownership on the cap table for all those who have actually invested in your company, which is very important. So we've covered a lot of ground today, and we've been talking with Nehal Mehta, CEO and founder of Mobius Scientific. What haven't we discussed that you want to let the listeners know before we close, Nehal?
I think we covered a great amount of ground today, Rich, and I just want the listeners to know that there's no reason why entrepreneurship should feel like a black box. I know that some people feel as though every segment of this could be considered unknown. I just want to reiterate the joy that I have felt during this transition. And if there's ever a time that I'm able to support an entrepreneur or be there to provide any guidance or support, I would be happy to do so because this is a long journey. I always used to say to my students, of which I graduated about 100 or so from the NIH programs over 10 years, that if you're going to go and consider anything in academic medicine or academic educational merits, you're going to want to consider that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so with the entrepreneurship, it's a great journey that I've started, and I'm looking forward to learning from folks like you, as well as having the capital region around me as I grow through this journey.
Well, we wish you the best of luck. And you talk about AMD, which is very important to your technology. There's another 3-letter acronym, which is very important to you as a CEO, and that's ABR. Do you know what that is?
I don't.
Always be raising.
I love that.
Yeah, because you talked about your 5 million, then the 40 million. One of the things you probably learned is you just can't be a scientist. You just can't be the leader of the company, but you have to be the fundraiser and the rainmaker every day.
That is exactly right. Vision capital, people capital is ABR. I like that, Rich.
Nehal Mehta, thank you very much for being on BioTalk. And we're going to see a year from now or even sooner if you're still as enthusiastic about this entrepreneurial journey you're on.
I'm looking forward to it, Rich. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.